The Middle East has descended into a huge diplomatic row. Four Gulf countries, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Bahrain and the UAE have severed diplomatic ties with Qatar, while Saudi Arabia and Bahrain have also closed their borders with the country. They accuse Doha of supporting terrorism and interfering in the internal affairs of Arab states.
In order to protect our national security from the threat of terrorism and extremism, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia has decided to sever diplomatic ties with Qatar.
The government of Egypt has decided to cut diplomatic ties with Qatar due to the country's hostile attitude towards Egypt and the failure of all attempts to discourage Qatar from supporting terrorist organizations.
Due to Qatar's persistent attempts to destabilize security in Bahrain and interfere in our internal affairs, and due to media incitement and support for armed terrorist activities and the financing of groups associated with Iran, the government of Bahrain has severed diplomatic relations with Doha.
The spat comes after Qatar's state-run news agency was reportedly hacked. Following the breach, comments attributed to Qatar's emir were published, in which the country's leader expressed support for Iran, Hamas, Hezbollah and Israel. He also suggested US President Donald Trump may not last long in power. And Qatar's government denied the comments were made and branded the story, quote, fake news. Well, to discuss this now, we can cross live to Middle East analyst Ali Risk joining us here on RT International. Good morning to you, Ali. What do you think is potentially the real reason behind this spat?
Well, I think that Qatar wasn't very enthusiastic for what took place during Donald Trump's visit to Saudi Arabia. Basically, what took place during Donald Trump's visit, we saw Donald Trump, going heavily into the Saudi camp. We saw the outright hostility, unprecedented hostility in language which is used by Saudi King Salman towards Iran. And I think that Qatar basically isn't very enthusiastic about an outright hostile anti-Iranian agenda for many different reasons. One of them being the natural gas field, which is shared by Iran and Qatar, and for other reasons, maybe Qatar is more calculated when it comes to regional tension. It doesn't want a spike in sectarian tension. So I think that is one of the main reasons, Qatar's lack of enthusiasm for what took place during those summits, whereby there was that hostility expressed towards Iran. And hence we had this result, which indeed is unprecedented, not just cutting off diplomatic ties, closing, the border, land border, the sea border. So it is something which we haven't seen, especially when it comes to ties between GCC countries. But that being said, I'm not sure that the Trump administration is unwelcoming. In fact, I think the Donald Trump administration might be somewhat satisfied with what happened, because if you recall, Donald Trump placed Hamas within the same framework of terrorist organizations in that speech he made in Riyadh. And Qatar is known to have close ties with Hamas. Indeed, the head of the Hamas political bureau, Khaled Mish'al, he resides in Qatar. So even the Trump administration, I believe, has its own fair share of differences.
Ali, if I can, I understand what you're saying with potential Trump ties here. It's really interesting, the insight you're offering here on the program today. But ultimately, cutting their ties, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain and other governments accusing Qatar of supporting terrorist groups and destabilizing the region. Saudi Arabia accusing Qatar of supporting terrorists. Some might call that a case of the pot calling the kettle black.
Indeed, I couldn't agree more. It's been documented time and again that it's Saudi Arabia which is the one, behind terrorist, the Wahhabi ideology, which it's Saudi Arabia which has spread this ideology through its madrasas. Many in the British newspapers say that the Manchester attack, for example, is a result of the spread of the Wahhabi ideology. what's happening all throughout the world. But, you know, I think that's just a result of the double standards we live in. Just an important point to highlight, which I'm sure you're aware of, is that when they refer to Qatar supporting terrorist organizations, I think their main focus here is Qatar's close ties with the Muslim Brotherhood. We all know that, you know, Hamas is known to be close to the Muslim Brotherhood. Many people in the Muslim Brotherhood reside or live in Qatar. And Saudi Arabia, the UAE in particular, the Egyptian president, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, that's the explanation behind his decision. It's because of Qatar's close ties with the Muslim Brotherhood. So that association, I think, focuses on these links with between Qatar and the Brotherhood. But what you said is completely true. Saudi Arabia, way more than Qatar, has played a role in propagating or spreading the extremist ideology which terrorism feeds upon.
And we still see, for example, 10 Downing Street or Washington with Trump's recent visit, they still appear to be cozying up to the Saudi royal family.
Yes, it's interesting that we haven't seen from the government officials in the West any accusations, any criticism of Saudi Arabia, of the responsibility Saudi Arabia has in spreading this terrorism. And I think that the more the Western governments deny a Saudi role or a Saudi Wahhabi linkage to the spread of terrorist attacks, the more these terrorist attacks will continue. Because if you don't address that ideological problem, then, you know, there's no way you can put a stop to this, whatever be the measures you take within the country. Look, in just a period of days, we've had 2 attacks in Britain. We had first in Manchester, now we had this knife attack, this other attack in London. And more of this is still to come if Saudi Arabia continues to succeed in evading responsibility. And until now, whether it be with Theresa May in Britain or with Donald Trump, Saudi Arabia has evaded responsibility and is even being falsely depicted as one of the countries at the forefront in a fight against terror, which is completely false.
Oh, and let's get back to the nuts and bolts of the matter here. Just very quickly, 4 Gulf countries, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Bahrain, the UAE, severing diplomatic ties with Qatar. This is about comments by the Emir showing support for Hezbollah, Hamas, but it's all been hacked and reportedly is fake news, and yet the rest of the Middle East does seem to be taking this reportedly fake news very, very seriously. What's going to be the next step here? What kind of potential consequences are we going to witness now in the region?
Well, I think that first and foremost, what happens benefits Iran. I think that's an important conclusion to make because contrary to what many had expected that you'd see, quote-unquote, a anti-Iranian Sunni bloc as a result of what happened in Riyadh. Now, with this development, I think you have clear divisions within this so-called Sunni bloc, and these divisions within that, you know, so-called Sunni bloc, in the end, would benefit Iran and its allies, not to have this united front. It's also, we have to wait and see if other Gulf countries would follow suit. Kuwait, for example, will it do so or not? Because Kuwait also doesn't share this enthusiasm for enmity with Iran. The same goes for Oman. But I think answering your question, as I said, and I repeat, the biggest issue of significance, I think, as a result of this, is that you don't have that united Sunni bloc against Iran, which has been clearly revealed now.
All right, Middle East analyst Ali Risk joining us live here on RT International with insight on the breaking news. Thank you very much indeed.